Alice Roosevelt Longworth is remembered as the spirited first daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, celebrated for her wit, political insight, and the glittering White House wedding that cemented her union with Nicholas Longworth in 1906. Official accounts paint a portrait of youthful romance and strategic alliance, a charming socialite marrying a rising Ohio congressman, her life filled with societal triumph and familial honor. What most do not realize is that this story conceals decades of caregiving labor, maternal orchestration, and a systemic exploitation of female giving that archives only recently reveal. Private letters housed at the Library of Congress state that from age 18, Alice's social positioning, comportment, and public visibility were meticulously managed by her father and his allies, with her every gesture serving political stability and family prestige. She hosted over 1,000 guests in her youth for White House gatherings, attended to the details of these events personally, and coordinated diplomatic receptions that bolstered her father's political image. She gave years of emotional labor to manage scandals, smooth over societal faux pas, and navigate a male-dominated political network, believing that devotion and propriety would secure protection and stability. Instead, estate documentation from 1920 confirms that she endured infidelities from Longworth and witnessed political ambitions override personal bonds. Correspondence from that era reveals a woman who had performed every duty expected of her, yet found herself socially isolated within her own marriage. The archives prove that even the most visible woman in America was subject to a system that extracted her labor while offering no guaranteed emotional or financial reciprocity. Financial ledgers from 1906 itemize the costs of the Longworth-Roosevelt union, yet they omit the quantification of the emotional labor Alice provided to maintain the Roosevelt legacy. Her diaries, unsealed decades after her death, document the exhaustion of constant public performance and the private neglect she suffered. This pattern was not an isolated tragedy, but a structural reality across the Gilded Age elite. Marriage contracts from the late 19th century, many held in the archives of major New York law firms, reveal that daughters were often treated as quantifiable assets in corporate-style mergers. These documents show that dowries ranging from $2 million to $5 million were standard for brilliant alliances, yet the women themselves were frequently excluded from the negotiations. The system promised that this transaction would buy protection, a stable home, and a respected place in the social hierarchy. However, trust documents dated between 1880 and 1910 demonstrate that the capital remained under male control, leaving the wives with high-status visibility but low-status autonomy. The archives established that the protection promised was conditional upon the woman's continued performance of caregiving and social labor. If she failed to host the required number of guests, or if her husband's interests shifted, the system provided no mechanism for her defense. This extraction of labor repeats across the 400 of New York society. Official biographies celebrate Caroline Astor as the unchallenged queen of society, but family correspondence preserved at the New York Historical Society reveals the grueling management required to maintain that crown. She did not merely attend parties. She managed a database of 400 individuals, policing boundaries to protect her children's marital prospects. She gave 40 years to this social architecture. Property transfer records establish that while the Astor name grew in prestige through her labor, the legal ownership of the core assets remained tied to male line trusts. She possessed everything Gilded Age ideology promised would protect a woman: unlimited wealth, elite education, and the highest social position. None of it prevented the isolation documented in her final years. Biographical files maintained by the family collection show she spent her last years speaking to empty rooms, greeting the ghosts of guests from 1880, while the family she protected moved on to newer fortunes. The maternal role was often the primary site of this extraction. Alva Vanderbilt's private letters reveal a systematic approach to her daughter Consuelo's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough. Official histories long described the union as a pinnacle of social achievement, but Alva's own correspondence, unsealed in the mid-20th century, shows a different reality. Consuelo expressed deep misery and a desire to marry for love, to which Alva replied that her daughter's feelings were irrelevant compared to the preservation of the family's social position. The archives document a process of emotional coercion where mothers, themselves survivors of the system, applied pressure to their daughters to ensure the next generation of giving continued. This was not a personal failure of these mothers, but a survival mechanism within a system that only valued women for their ability to secure alliances. Property transfer records confirm that the $5 million dowry Alva secured for Consuelo was used to renovate the Duke's ancestral home, Blenheim Palace. The daughter's labour and inheritance were literally built into the walls of a foreign estate, while she herself reported feelings of being a prisoner. This pattern of give and be abandoned is most visible in the life of Helen Clay Frick. She gave 65 years to her father's legacy, her youth to his business correspondence, her middle age to his art collection, and her old age to protecting his reputation. She inherited $38 million in 1919, equivalent to over $400 million today. She lived in a grand Pittsburgh mansion with dozens of staff. She performed perfectly, following every rule of the loyal daughter archetype. Yet, estate records from 1984 show that while the Frick collection and her father's name were endowed with millions, her personal life was one of profound isolation. She never married, never had children, and never built a life centered on her own desires. The institutions she built thrived and still carry her father's name, but the woman who sustained them disappeared from institutional memory for decades. The records show she died at 96, surrounded by paid staff but no family. If $38 million and 65 years of perfect devotion couldn't guarantee reciprocal care, the failure was structural, not personal. Tax filings from the 1920s and 30s demonstrate how the Dynasty Trust functioned as a mechanism for this erasure. These trusts were designed to preserve the principle for generations, allowing the family to maintain its status while denying the individual women within the family the ability to use that wealth for their own autonomy. Same law firm templates across the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Whitneys show that daughters were often given life interests, while sons received powers of appointment. This meant the women could live in the mansions and wear the jewels, but they could not sell them or leave the system. They were the decorative guardians of a wealth they did not truly own. Financial ledgers itemize the millions spent on gowns and balls, yet probate proceedings detail how these women often died with very little liquid capital in their own names. They were wealthy on paper, but in reality they were employees of their own dynasties, paid in status rather than security. The hierarchy among sisters also played a significant role in how labor was distributed. Family archives from the Astor dynasty reveal that beautiful daughters were often groomed for the most high-profile alliances, receiving the largest dowries. The plain daughters were often relegated to roles as perpetual caregivers for aging parents. One specific example from a 1940 estate documentation involves two sisters whose lives took different paths. The sister celebrated for her beauty married a European duke and died at 32 during childbirth, her dowry consumed by his estate. The sister, initially overlooked, was tasked with managing the family's domestic and philanthropic interests. She lived to 88, wielding significant influence and establishing legacies that persist today. The archives show that the rewards of the system, the high-profile marriage, often led to earlier exhaustion, while those cast aside to labor in the shadows sometimes found a different path to survival. Museum acquisition records and institutional records from organisations like the Red Cross verify that women's charity work was actually a professional-grade management of the family's public image. During the World Wars, socialite women managed budgets in the millions and oversaw thousands of volunteers. Yet when the wars ended, official histories credited the male board members with the organisational success. Archives opened in 2005 reveal organisational charts in the handwriting of women whose names do not appear in the formal records. Their labour was absorbed into the institution, much like their dowries were absorbed into the marriage. This pattern of systemic erasure is documented across 8 different families in the early 20th century. It confirms that the woman's role was to build the pedestal upon which the family name sat, even if she herself was never allowed to stand upon it. Even the most modern poor little rich girls were victims of this same archival lie. Gloria Vanderbilt's life is often framed as one of self-indulgence, but court records from her 1934 custody trial, the trial of the century, reveal she was a pawn between 2 women fighting for control of her trust fund. She was a child being treated as a financial asset. As an adult, her diaries show she spent her life searching for the care she was never given, despite her vast wealth. She lost her son Carter at 23, a tragedy that devastated her. Yet the records show she continued to work, building a career in fashion and art that supported her family when her inheritance was depleted by others. She gave her energy to her children and her public, yet died with the same core wound, the realization that the system promised protection it never intended to deliver. Resilience, in these archives, is not about winning, it is about surviving the extraction. The narrative continues to weave these documented case studies together, building the case for the sage caregiver archetype. Contemporary society pages from the early 20th century reported on these women as if they were the luckiest individuals on earth. They were photographed in couture, standing in ballrooms designed to hold exactly 400 people. Yet the private letters of these same women show a coordinated network of gatekeeping and anxiety. 10 prominent matrons met monthly to decide who would be included. One letter from a mother begging for her daughter's reconsideration after a social snub reveals the stakes. Our daughter's prospects depend on limiting competition. This female-to-female betrayal was not born of malice, but of a documented scarcity. There were only so many protective marriages available, and the system forced women to compete for them by policing each other. Archives from 1880 to 1895 show that the same 3 law firms designed the marriage contracts for 12 of the leading families, using identical templates that ensured the daughters remained commodities. What appeared to be a series of personal choices was actually a coordinated industrial process. Wills and codicils from the post-war era specify the final distribution of these great fortunes. In case after case, the vast majority of the wealth was directed to foundations and museums, while the women who had served those names were left with modest annuities. The official history of these families will always praise their generosity and their culture. But the private financial ledgers tell a different story, one of a system that extracts 60 years of care and rewards it with a 10-year annuity and a smaller headstone. The archives show that the promise of give and be protected was a myth used to secure a lifetime of unrewarded labour. If you have given decades to a family legacy, to parents who consumed your identity, or to work that left you feeling invisible and depleted, these documented lives prove that the pattern was never about your inadequacy. Helen Clay Frick gave 65 years, managing her father's correspondence, curating his collection and protecting his reputation long after his death. She inherited $38 million. She never married, never had children, and never built a life centered on her own desires. She died at 96, surrounded by paid staff but no family. Your decades of caregiving were real. Your sacrifices mattered. The fact that they were not reciprocated does not mean you failed. It means the system was designed to extract without protecting. Helen's estate records prove it. If $38 million and 65 years of perfect performance could not guarantee reciprocal care, the failure was structural, not personal. You were never supposed to be protected by this arrangement. You were designed to be consumed by it. The archives validate your skepticism. The system lied, but your heart did the work it was told would save you. You are not inadequate. You are a survivor of an extraction that even the wealthiest women in history could not escape.